Hey everyone, it's Jana from The Last Stitch. In today's video I will talk about a topic that I'm very passionate about, and that is seam allowance, because unlike what a lot of pattern companies will have us believe, there's not one seam allowance that fits all. Instead, for the best result, you definitely should experiment with different width depending both on the seam you're sewing, the fabric you're using, and what type of project you're intending to do. So in today's video I will give you my tips for best type of seam allowance for each project and type of seam, and also some tools that I use when it comes to adding and also retracting seam allowance. First of all, a little bit of background story here about seam allowance, because it does differ depending on where in the world you're living. For instance, here in Europe it's very common that the pattern doesn't have seam allowance, so you're basically able to add whatever seam allowance you want, which is the upside. The downside is of course that you have to add seam allowance to every seam on your pattern, which can be quite time consuming. Whereas for instance, I know that in North America, usually the seam allowance are always included in the pattern. So that means if you want to change the seam allowance, then you also have your work cut out for you. So yeah, it does come with a little bit of extra work when you want to customize the seam allowance, but on the other hand, I find that it just gives me a lot better result if I put some thinking into what type of width I want to have for each seam that I'm sewing. So that's what I'm going to talk about now. First of all, a little bit of caveat. As you know, here in Europe, in most countries I think, we are fond of the metric system. That's our standard. But I know a lot of you guys use inches, so I will do my best to convert these. But if I make some mistakes, which probably will happen, I will definitely make sure that I add some graphics in post-production, correcting if I do some wrong converting here, because it's definitely a little bit hard still to get my head around the inches system. But I'm doing my best, and also actually done a little bit of a cheat sheet here next to me, so hopefully I will not mess up too much. Now the standard seam allowance for most pattern is 50 millimeters or 5/8 inches, which is probably, I would say, the industry standard, and you will find that added to pretty much any seams. In fact, some of the American companies, they even add it to knits, which is a separate topic that I will go on ranting about in a bit. But yeah, that is definitely shows how hard and very sticky this type of standard is. But it can definitely add some problems when you're sewing if you're working with that sort of seam allowance on some types of projects. So I'm definitely going to address that. But first of all, I'm going to talk about when I do think that a 5/8 inches or a 50 millimeter seam allowance is actually a good idea. Well, that is primarily when you're sewing side seams. For instance, if you're sewing side seams that you want to be pressed apart when you're doing trousers, then that is the perfect width. As also skirts, and well, any type of seam where you need that extra margins. For also, it's a good way if you're a little bit unsure if you're between two sizes, actually having that wider seam allowance, which is 5/8 inches or 50 millimeters, then it actually gives you a little bit of margins, to actually take out the seam if you end up having a garment that is a bit too tight. So I'm actually a big fan of using 50 millimeters for seam allowance in the side seams when you're doing that type of garment, but that's pretty much the only case where I actually use that. I'm going to give some examples now on when I change the seam allowance. I think the biggest problem with that wide seam allowance, 5/8 inches, is when you're sewing curved seam, because if you have that wide seam allowance, for instance on a collar, like this Peter Pan collar I've done here, you can see it has a pretty pronounced curve, right? And if you're having 50 millimeter seam allowance here, you will first of all end up with a really bulky seam, and the seam allowance will extend way into the collar. And secondly, you will have a lot of trouble creating that curve when you're trying to fold it over and press it. So then you will usually have to resort to clipping the seam to make sure that it lies flat. That definitely works, but one drawback of clipping the seam is that it definitely weakens the seam. Whereas if you probably noticed that if you reduce the seam allowance, say to 1 centimeter, which is about 3/8 inches, then you will have much less problems with getting the seam allowance to lie flat, and also of course you will reduce bulk. In fact, in the garment industry I think it's common to even use a less wide seam allowance. You can actually go down to even 6 millimeters, which is 1/4 of inch, right? that I find a little bit tricky to navigate on some slippery fabrics. But if you're working with stable fabrics and you don't want to remove any additional seam allowance afterwards or having to clip, then definitely try to experiment and see if you can manage that, because these seams will not be under a lot of stress, so they can definitely handle having a smaller seam allowance. So don't worry about that. It's just basically learning how to sew with a smaller seam allowance. Another example where a smaller seam allowance makes a lot of sense is if you're doing some type of rounded neckline and you want to add facing. The same goes for a sleeveless type of top and you want to add facing. Again, I definitely recommend that you reduce the width of the seam allowance. 1 centimeter is definitely a good compromise between having enough width to work with and still, you know, not adding that extra bulk. But again, if you can definitely try to see if you can reduce that even more, because again, unless the fabric is really slippery or very delicate, you know, 1 centimeter seam allowance is plenty enough to make sure that you have a durable seam. And you can of course remove extra seam allowance afterwards, but I personally find that it's actually quite hard to cut that even, and sometimes, especially if you're working with delicate fabric, it's pretty important to have like even seam allowance, because sometimes, you know, it peeks through. So the more narrow you can get it, and also the more even you can get it, definitely will add to the end result. It looks much more pristine. So yeah, I'm a big fan of trying to keep that rounded shapes, those curves, to make sure that I really have a rather small seam allowance. And if we move on to the sleeves, again, I personally find that having that 5/8 inches or 50mm seam allowance when you're inserting the sleeve to the sleeve opening, I definitely find that it's a little bit too much to work with, especially if it's very curved. So I personally prefer to go down to about 12mm, which is about 1/2 of an inch, right? I find that more manageable than the full 50mm seam allowance. That is not a big difference, but I definitely find it more workable. You can even try to go down to 1 centimeter, but then I find it can get a little bit tricky, especially if it's hard to insert the sleeve. And what I do, because I have a serger, is that I don't really overcast the edges of the fabric before I attach the sleeve. Instead, I leave the edges of the fabric untouched, then I attach the sleeve to the sleeve opening using a regular straight stitch, and then I insert the full sewn sleeve in the serger, and then I overcast the edges, or overlock the edges of both layers at the same time. And this, I find, creates a really durable seam, because you actually have 2 rows of stitching keeping it together. So for me, I find that works, and I usually try to trim it down so it's no more wider than about 1 centimeter. So that's a good compromise for me, and 1 centimeter is about 3/8 inches, I think. Hopefully I will not mess that up. It's still a little bit hard to remember those, but I'm doing my best here. My brain is basically boiling trying to convert this in real time. So, but hopefully that is right. So that's how I do with my sleeves. Some obviously like to have a wider seam allowance because it's easy to control, but I don't find that it's necessary. Definitely, I've never noticed that being much of an issue. And we're working with like rectangular shapes like cuffs and waistband. Again, I do not recommend that you go the full 50mm 5/8 inches seam allowance. Why, you may ask? Well, it adds massive amount of bulk, and you definitely want, you know, your seams to look neat and trim. For instance, if you're doing like a cuff here, and the cuff is I think about 4 centimeters wide, right? And if you keep the full seam allowance there, you will have 3 centimeters of extra fabric. So you just put a tiny piece in the middle here, which is not covered by us 2 layers of extra fabric, and that I don't think makes for nice finishing. So I definitely never ever add more seam allowance than 1 centimeter or 3/8 inches when I'm doing cuffs. That also applies for waistband. The same thinking I have about that. Again, this is not a seam that will be under a lot of stress. For instance, if you're doing a sleeve that obviously moves a lot, but the cuffs, well, you can definitely go lower. That I would actually say, if you're really skilled, you know, handling the fabric, I should say go below 3/8 inches or 1 centimeter. It can definitely work as well, because again, if you can reduce that, the end result will look so much nicer. But I prefer to use 1 centimeter because then I have the perfect mix of control, but not too much bulky seam. And again, speaking of bulk, since I'm closing the seam, which I'm doing with cuffs and the waistband, I don't overcast or overlock the edges, I just leave them raw, and again that really keeps the bulk down. And one particular challenge or thinking is when you're adding zipper, I like to have the seam allowance to match the width of the zipper tape. So again, that really depends on what type of zipper you're using. So if you have a good idea about the zipper you're using, you can actually add the seam allowance to match that up, because that makes it so much easier. If you can align the edge of the zipper tape with the edge of the fabric, that makes installing zipper so much easier. I definitely recommend that you let the zipper tape decide what type of seam allowance you're adding when it comes to that type of seams. Even regardless if it's a crotch seam or if it's a back seam or a side seam, I definitely think it's a good idea to match those two things. And one particular challenge or thinking is when you're adding zipper, I like to have the seam allowance to match the width of the zipper tape. So again, that really depends on what type of zipper you're using. So if you have a good idea about the zipper you're using, you can actually add the seam allowance to match that up, because that makes it so much easier. If you can align the edge of the zipper tape with the edge of the fabric, that makes installing zipper so much easier. I definitely recommend that you let the zipper tape decide what type of seam allowance you're adding when it comes to that type of seams. Even regardless if it's a crotch seam or if it's a back seam or a side seam, I definitely think it's a good idea to match those two things. And for shoulder seam, again, not a fan of the full 5/8 50mm. Instead, I like to reduce it to 12mm, which hovers around 3/8 inches to about half an inch. I just find that just looks much more needed, because you don't really need that big wide seam allowance for shoulder, if you ask me. And finally, when it comes to seam allowance, I want to talk about knits. Again, if you're working with stretch knits, I highly recommend that you use a seam allowance that matches the width of the stitch you use. So for instance, on a sewing machine, if you're using some type of the stretch stitches, they will usually be about 5 to 6 to 7mm wide, which is roughly a 1/4 of an inch. So I think that's a good ballpark. If you're using a serger, they usually, again, hovers around 6 to 7mm. It depends a little bit on the stitch width. You can actually regulate that on a serger. So that's what I try to aim for, because that good part about that is that you can actually align the fabric at the edge of either the presser foot on the sewing machine, or if you have a serger, you actually align the edge of the fabric with a knife, so you're not really cutting away any fabric, just a smidgen, just a tiny slice. And the good part about that is much more easy to sew that evenly than if you're trying to gauge on the seam guide of the serger how much you cut away, because to be honest, it's not that easy. Also, you will save unnecessary extra fabric if you just follow that method, and you don't need to worry about having that slipping. Again, it's just about learning to control the fabric, and I find that with a little bit of practice, you can definitely work really successful using that type of seam allowance. So you definitely feel free to argue with me. I'm really curious to hear your thoughts about seam allowance in general. What do you recommend? Have you had any hiccups with different seam allowance, or are you a big fan rather of going wide and then removing? So I'm really curious to know what your take on it. But this is my ideas about that, and I do find that they work really well, so I probably will stick by them, but I'm also always curious to hear what you guys are doing as well. Now, as I said, customizing the seam allowance, that will usually add some challenging, so you definitely need to have some type of tools. Now, here in Europe, the most common tools are the ones that you use to add seam allowance. This is a seam gauge, or a ficus, we call it in Sweden. And this one is my favorite, and I know it's not really readily available everywhere. I much prefer this one over this one, which I don't like at all. Perhaps I have a rubbish one, because this one is not stable enough, and it's much harder to actually gauge. Whereas this one has settled on a very specific set of numbers that are commonly used. So for instance, I have 1 centimeters, 1.5 centimeters, which is 5 inches, 2 centimeters, 3 centimeters, 4 centimeters, and 6 centimeters. So you can see here, each corner is the same as a given width. So you can use this for adding hem allowance and also for side seam allowance. So this is what I use primarily when I'm adding seam allowance. But I do think if you want to remove and you have a set number, you can again use this type of seam guide to just make sure that you remove the exact amount. Also, another way, of course, to add seam allowance is to use some type of see-through ruler with a lot of measurements on it. This one is a regular quilting ruler. It works very well, I think, for adding seam allowance, especially when you're working with straight seams. You can also invest in a pattern ruler. This one has definitely seen a little bit worse for wear, to be honest, but the good part about this one is that it also have curves for the seam allowance, so it's much easier to use this one. It's from Schoben Fashion. It's called Schoben Fashion Curve. It definitely has lost a lot of the blackness, which why I'm not 100% recommending it. That said, I've had it for over 10 years, so it's definitely it served well for a long time, but I wish though that they had made the printing much more durable long term. But I know there are a lot of other companies doing this, and if you are really serious about pattern making or adding seam allowance, then you definitely, I think, should also invest in some type of curve ruler that has the seam allowance added. If you want to see in action how I add seam allowance to patterns, you can check out my video on how I trace from the Burdastyle magazine, because that involves a lot of adding seam allowance, so I have some tricks for that you will find in that video. And of course, if you have any questions, please tell me and I will do my best to answer. And of course, I'm really curious, what are your thoughts about seam allowance? Are you a fan of the 15mm 5/8 inches and have other ways of solving the issues that I'm talking about? I'd love to know, because it's definitely, I think, a topic that we'll have a lot of different opinions on for sure. I am pretty firm in my belief that having a varying amount of seam allowance yields better result, but I'm definitely prepared to be challenged on that, so I'd love to hear your inputs on that as well. So please keep the discussion going, and I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you haven't already, please subscribe for weekly sewing videos. Stay safe, and I'll see you next time.